Welcome to Meteor Interviews, a series of interviews with Meteor developers, community, and core team members.
Today I'm speaking with Ben Berman, CTO of the LA-based startup Workpop. Workpop is a large production Meteor app and was one of the first commercial Meteor apps. Hi Ben, thanks for taking the time to speak with me.
Hey Paul, nice to join you.
Thanks. So Workpop works on mobile in the browser, which I'm proud that OKGrow had a small part in, but you're also building native apps and you recently launched the iOS app. So my goal for today is to learn about building native mobile apps that work with Meteor. Now, I know that Abhi and Alex were on the Meteor Club podcast, which just came out yesterday, talking about similar topic. They had a good conversation about mobile as well, and I would recommend everyone take a listen to that. But this is going to be complimentary, so we're going to go into some technical stuff here. So, and I also want to mention before we get into it too much that Workpop is hiring. So if what they're doing sounds interesting, you should get in touch with Ben. So tell me, what is Workpop?
Workpop is a jobs board in the Los Angeles area. We're trying to help people looking for hourly jobs find the kinds of small businesses, mom and pop stores, Main Street sort of work that will give them that job. We're a kind of like Craigslist meets part of an applicant tracking system. So something like a way you can review candidates. So we both serve people who are looking for jobs and people who are hiring. We're currently only in Los Angeles. We have a great deal of penetration now here in LA. We're going to be expanding soon. And we're primarily the workpop.com web app, along with two mobile apps that are in development. One, an iOS app, which you can download off the App Store now, and an Android app that'll be available soon. So we've been building out our products primarily to help people looking for hourly jobs meet the small businesses who are hiring for them.
Cool. So not for software developers so much, more for hourly jobs. Okay, so
Yeah.
So when did you start development of Workpop? And how long have you been working with Meteor?
We actually began, the four of us, me, J.U., Chris Ovitz, and Reed Schaffner. We all began about a year ago. We'd all been working together at a video gaming startup here in Los Angeles. And we were really inspired by this idea of helping people find work who really, really needed it. I think that the market had plenty of websites and apps and services for the sorts of software professionals like you and me to find work, and frankly, a lot of us have a fairly easy time finding it. On the other hand, for people who are looking for barista or cashier positions, people who are looking for something that 60 million American workers do, it's much harder to find work. So we built our website around providing for them, and it's been very, very successful. We started about a year ago. We decided to use Meteor based on my experience using it. I used it for about 2 years up until then. So now I've been using it since about version 0.59, so 0.5.9. I got into it back in December of 2012 when I released a Cards Against Humanity game built with it that used, at the time, my own ad hoc Cordova solution for bringing it to Android and iPhone. It was a mobile web app. I got a lot of attention from the Meteor developers themselves, and the game was really popular. So I was really glad to see that the platform worked for me then, and I continued to use it up until it came to about March of last year when we really had to start cranking out code for Workpop. So I felt it was the right choice, and it was really informed by my experience over the previous 2 years.
Right. So that was pretty early. Cool.
Yeah.
So so for the market that you guys serve, mobile is obviously really important. So that's going to be what we'll talk about. So it would have been cheaper probably for you guys to do a Cordova app. So I'm curious why you went the native route. Can you talk a little bit about that?
When we're working with a very large number of devices and experiences that we want to deliver, it's not so straightforward to always just pick one technology and go with it. The reality is Workpop was designed at the end of the day to work as both a mobile web app, desktop web app, and something that could work with iOS, Android, or whatever future device might come out in the next 5 years. We made the decision based to support native apps, largely because of that's where a lot of our talent is. One of our developers, Seth Sandler, has been making Apple featured apps for quite some time now. And we believed, and we were correct in this belief, that he could deliver a very, very unique and powerful experience for Apple users. And because of that, we wanted to build a platform in a way that could support him rather than shoehorning the experience into a particular methodology. So ultimately, I trusted him as a team member to bring a experience that felt better than every other job app in the App Store today. And I think, honestly, we've delivered on that.
Yeah.
Do I think we could have delivered that through Cordova? That remains to be seen. I personally could not do that, but Seth could do it in a native app.
Yeah.
So a lot of our decision was based on where the talent was.
Right. And no compromises in the experience for the user. So
Not a
yeah. Okay, so when would you recommend, how would you recommend someone make that decision? So if you were trying to decide, go with Cordova and stick with a single code base versus building one or more clients, what do you have to say to someone that's making that kind of decision right now?
I think part of the development philosophy at Workpop is each developer, each product owner should get control as much of the experience as possible. And one of the reasons we chose Meteor as a platform is because it can let you do that. You can really control everything that you want to show a user. If you think that you want to control the mobile experience for Android and iOS and a proper desktop web app experience, then you should probably go with Cordova. It is very, very difficult to be both an expert web developer and an expert iOS and expert Android developer.
Definitely. Yeah. So you're going to need to have the talent to do a couple of platforms.
Yeah, and I think that part of the reason you should choose Meteor is if you really want to keep your energy focused on a small number of people being able to deliver on very, very big things. So if you believe that you want to maintain a small team of highly talented people and you want them to all contribute those talents to a web app, something that's principally used as a web app, then definitely you want to use the Cordova integrations that ship with Meteor. If instead you want to focus on an iOS app, then you should definitely make it native, and that's where all of your energy should go.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so your iOS app, it's a fully native app, and it connects to the same Meteor backend as obviously as the Meteor app itself, using DDP, right?
That's right.
So can you give an overview of how that works?
In order to deliver the API and the data to the iOS app, many people would normally write a traditional RESTful interface. So I believe at least some early attempts at getting iOS native apps integrated with Meteor apps involved rewriting a traditional RESTful API that just returns JSON data as it conventionally would.
Yep.
When we started development of the native app in June of last year, we decided that we would integrate with the Meteor app directly with the DDP protocol. To be really pedantic, DDP is more akin to your decision of using a RESTful interface versus a socket interface. It's a way of communicating, but it doesn't really say anything about what you're communicating about. The reason we were excited about integrating directly with a web app is we would only have to maintain one API, and it would force us to develop the API for the web app in a very consistent and clean way to maintain compatibility with iOS. So in a sense, everybody benefited from better quality and lower development time by using the native API that the Meteor web app client uses.
Yeah.
This also made it very, very easy for somebody who's implementing an iOS app to record all of the API actions in the web app and see how that experiences matches with the phone. So in terms of rapid development without needing lots of documentation, it was a really, really good experience for Seth, and it meant that he fundamentally did not need to constantly investigate the code or constantly ask questions about something that somebody else wrote.
Right, because you already had all your publications available through DDP. It was all there working already for the web app, so you could just start connecting to it from the iOS app.
That's right.
So, and I noticed just on that topic that just in the last day or so, Sashko from the Meteor Development Group has started a bit of a public discussion about how to provide REST APIs, maybe with less work from Meteor, but I don't think that's not really going anywhere yet. So it might be I don't think that's any. There's no code that's been written as far as I can tell. It's just sort of a discussion about how it might work. So with GDP, when you're writing a Meteor app, I mean, you know that your data just kind of appears in the client, and there's a whole lot of other stuff that happens automatically. And maybe a lot of people might not be totally clear about what is GDP and which parts are the other parts of Meteor, like Tracker and things. So on the iOS app, when you have just GDP, that means you're at least just getting the change and updated data, but then that's maybe different than what you get available to you in JavaScript in a Meteor app. So what is actually provided for you by the iOS DDP library that you're using? Is it just raw data updates, or does it provide anything more?
We actually transitioned from using the Objective DDP library that many listeners might be familiar with to a new library called Meteor iOS that provides more of the functionality that the JavaScript Meteor client has. So specifically, to get really into Paul's question here, when you were using the web app, it does a lot of what is fundamentally messages of passing pieces of data into something where you can go and say collection.find.fetch. On an iOS app, about a year ago, that experience didn't exist. You would have to handle those messages specifically. Today, with Meteor iOS, with this more mature library, you're provided a wrapper that behaves very similarly to collections.find.fetch. What this means is that you will have a better experience developing in a way that's familiar with how you've been developing with the Meteor web app if you decide to use Meteor iOS as the connection library in your iOS app.
Cool. So it actually provides you something like collections and even a query interface?
That's right. And to be perfectly clear, on the web app, the Meteor team has gone to great lengths to make a API for querying and selecting and iterating through data consistent with how it works, consistent between the client and the server. Right. This is their big innovation in this sense is mini Mongo, this idea of, well, what if we implemented in JavaScript the Mongo query and update language so that when you execute code, whether on the client or server, it has the same effects on data. Right. On an iOS app, it may not make any sense to use the Mongo query language. One, because you can't share the code between the client and the server. Mm-hmm. So in the service of the web app's latency compensation, the MDG went to great lengths to make sure that the behavior was exactly the same so that you could get latency compensation and everything would be slick and beautiful. On an iOS app, you're not really using any server code. You can't. It's written in JavaScript.
Right.
So on the iOS app, Meteor iOS and our wrapper around Objective DDP to provide similar behavior actually just uses NS predicates. So it uses a very, very straightforward and iOS conventional query language against what are fundamentally arrays. For those of you who might be thinking, well, is that necessarily performant? Does that make any sense? The Meteor web app actually just iterates through every document when you do a query on the client.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is when you're dealing with hundreds of array elements, even a cell phone isn't going to necessarily struggle with that. So
Yeah, you're not supposed to have a large data set on the client, so it really shouldn't be an issue.
yeah, and that has been our experience, and it's far more important that we stay within the conventions of, well, how is an iOS developer familiar with iterating through a list, than, okay, now we have to implement the entire Mongo query language on iOS.
Right, that makes sense. So I think iOS has a data framework called Core Data, which I don't know much about. Does this use that?
Meteor iOS does support core data, and for those of you who aren't, long-time iOS developers, core data is the main is a early and pretty robust, in the opinion of some, convention for maintaining data on a device and rendering it in views on your iOS app. Meteor iOS, I believe, does support the core data conventions for manipulating, updating, and responding to changes in data. We specifically do not use them. In the opinions of our developers, we get to write a whole new app from scratch. We don't persist data, so we don't save what the Meteor server gives us to kind of permit an offline mode. This is an important part of core data, but we don't need it. A lot of the features that core data provides us, we wouldn't use anyway, so we decided not to use it. We do something far more straightforward.
Okay, that makes sense. And so when you change data on the client, do you directly make method calls?
In order to change data on the client, I believe the way that we've written our API, so this means what specifically, how do our method calls work? I actually think it's a very strong part of our architecture. We've tried to emulate the Mongo collection update API as much as possible when it comes to something like, okay, you want to update your job application.
Mm-hmm.
There's one way you can do it where you say, all right, I need a method, update job application name, update job application address, update job application zip code. You can create a method corresponding to every little piece of data that you might want to change.
Yeah.
Our API actually looks more like update application. It takes a query exactly written the same way as a Mongo query, and it takes an update written exactly the same way as a Mongo update. And if you set your first name, then our system will recognize, well, the software is asking to set the first name, literally $set profile.first_name. I have to compute what the complete name is, first name plus last name, to create the name field. Right. It's an API that means for the developer, it feels exactly like manipulating the data directly, but the server is smart enough to do all of the appropriate side effects. So it makes for a very robust and extremely long-lived API pattern. We've used the same API endpoint since March. We haven't had to rename anything or version anything in any significant way. Things have stayed relatively stable because of this convention. And because of that, in the iOS code itself, it's very straightforward to have a method called update job application and then accepts the exact things that you want to update. So it provides a really, really natural way to encode data updating that doesn't require many layers of indirection.
Okay, that makes sense. So in Meteor, you make method calls. So in the JavaScript Meteor client, so when you make method calls, like essentially you're making API calls from the client to the server, but you can also execute stubs of those methods locally. So in some cases, the same code executes locally on the client so that the UI can reflect the updated state immediately. And then that's kind of an optimistic way of of doing it, and occasionally something will come back different from the server, but normally you'll be able to just carry on earlier than you would have otherwise been able to. So in the iOS framework that you're using, do you have anything similar to that? Or if you make a method call that changes data on the server, do you have to wait for a round trip from the server?
At the moment, we do not do any latency compensation on the in the iOS device, on the iOS app.
Mm-hmm.
What Paul's describing is how the by having both the same code on the client and the server, you can simulate all of the data side effects, and your page can render those data side effects immediately, not waiting for a response from the server.
Yep.
Because of the nature of our app, which involves filling out a lot of forms, in a sense, your UI form widget, your text box or your radio button, it's often binded directly to a piece of data in a job application. The text box that contains your applicant's name is, in a sense, bound directly to the name. The text in it is the name text. When you change that on the device, it might take 160 milliseconds round trip from hitting next on the device and getting the updated user document back from the server. However, the text field itself already correctly reflects the name. That's its job. That's what the text field does. Yeah. So what we found is that even though for many, many, many apps, the simulation, the latency compensation can be a really rewarding part of the experience, because a lot of what we do is filling out forms, we already have a latency compensation built in. Mm-hmm. And it's just the way that UI widgets work. So we've been really fortunate that we haven't had to write a lot of that. Eventually we will. We think that if we start building out the employer experience for the phone, so you can review candidates in the iOS app, there is a significant amount of side effects that are simulated, and it does make our employer experience a lot snappier on the web app.
Yeah.
But we haven't crossed that bridge yet, so we think we'll do it, but at the moment we don't necessarily have to do latency compensation or simulation on the iOS app, because we get a lot of it for free due to the way that forms work.
Right. So, and if you did do that, it's not something that the framework provides yet, I guess. You'd have to do it yourself.
The Meteor iOS project, I believe, has a hook for performing latency compensation. I don't know if it keeps track of simulated data changes the way that the web app looks. So you can look at the Meteor code in detail, and you can see that it marks data as simulated while it's running the simulation. There's a lot of details there, and I'm not exactly sure how well the Meteor iOS library implements those details.
Okay.
But however, it is a relatively straightforward thing to do, and at least the way that we've architected our app, which is to do a lot of rendering reactively, we can support the trickiest part, the reactive rendering, out of the box.
Okay. And so at least they do kind of have the concept there. So maybe by the time you get to it, even if you don't know how robust it is right now, maybe it will be by then. Okay.
That's right.
Okay. So how about push notifications? You guys are using that, right?
We are.
And what library are you using for that?
So originally for our first revision of push notifications, we actually used the push notifications I wrote 2 years ago. And now we use a fork of RAIX's push package that we've taken internal until we can clean it up and make it work with Cordova again. But we definitely have integrated a push notification system with our general notifications abstraction in the Workpop code base.
Mm-hmm. So when the app receives a push notification and it says new data is available, I assume that you have to wait until the app opens and then resyncs via DDP. Nothing happens in the background, I guess. Is that true?
At the moment, nothing happens in the background, but we do package a tiny bit of data, whatever the payload provides, in the push notification. in order to, say, render a chat message immediately.
Okay.
So we're doing a little bit of tricks to not have to wait on a complete not to wait for a subscription to finish rendering. We kind of do want people to hit a push notification saying you have a new message and be able to respond immediately.
Right.
That's a really tricky experience to provide, and it's definitely on our roadmap to really refine to the point that it works in like a conventional, multi-$100 million chat app.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, ideally, DDP would, the data that your app is receiving by DDP, ideally that would sync in the background somehow.
Yeah, and architecturally speaking, Meteor servers already keep track a great deal of information about a user session that could, in theory, be used to fix all of the issues with persisting data from the server. How that's going to evolve, I'm not sure. Probably our priority, because we've, in our at least testing of the experience, we haven't had to do something too sophisticated for persistence.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So how about authentication? You're obviously using the same accounts, so you're using the Meteor user accounts packages. Does the framework that you're using on iOS provide that?
It provides password login, and we actually rolled our own solution for Facebook login.
Okay.
And I would suspect it's probably my most popular answer on Stack Overflow is how to do Facebook login with a native iOS Facebook SDK in a way that's supported by Meteor.
Oh, really? So lots of people are working on this too. That's great. Okay.
Yeah, at the time, I think even with the Cordova integration, people really wanted to show the native Facebook pop-up, and the Facebook authentication on iOS is a little trickier than a conventional OAuth authorization. So there are a few more details, and it involves definitely a lot of hacking the internals and doing things you're not supposed to in the Meteor app.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So how do you manage app versions? So obviously with a native app that's fully native app without hot code push, it's in the App Store. Not everybody is updating immediately when a new version comes out, but yet you're pushing a new version of your server code. So how do you keep it backwards compatible?
Let's talk about a concrete example. We just released both an updated version of the server and an updated version of the iOS app, which the server changed a great deal the way that chats worked. The messaging system got a total overhaul architecturally, got way faster, became a much better experience on the web app, but it was 100% incompatible with the iOS app. So what we did, and I'm kind of ashamed of saying how straightforward this is, but we just created another publication with a different name and versioned it by changing the string, and provided a emulation of what the web client what the iOS client expects in its publication, and the new publication has the better chat experience.
Okay, well that's pretty much what you would do with a REST API as well, if it's going to be a versioned API.
Yeah, and actually I spoke with Arunoda briefly, Arunoda Suripala, about how he does versioning, and he doesn't have an iOS app, but he recommended, to keep everything as flexible and unrenamed and extra data as possible to keep things compatible. He has to support a lot of different versions of the Kadira package that may be floating around in different apps. So there are a lot of different details with versioning. I think the most important thing, though, is to be creative. When we want to get rid of the old publication, which we will, we can't force people who are using the very first version of the iOS app to update. Most do. That's just how the App Store works now. It does automatic background updates for modern devices. But for those who don't, in this particular case, you'll open your inbox, and instead of doing a big translation, it'll just send a fake chat message that says, please update your iOS app.
Yeah.
Chat is not supported in this version anymore. And it's like, you got to be super creative. You don't want to have a versioning problem. You want to kill old versions.
Yeah.
Don't get mired in supporting 1% of users who may be using an old version. You really want everybody to have the latest and greatest, and you want to cajole them in doing it in the least invasive and most straightforward ways possible.
Yeah, so maybe make sure that the first version of your app that ever goes in the App Store has a mechanism to tell users that it's out of date.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So what were the biggest challenges you faced, either with Meteor or with the iOS app in general with WorkPop?
There were a lot of challenges, definitely around testing. So, we're a small team, so it's still a possibility to be very disciplined and say, don't change this. Don't change the way that the API works. Don't change what data this returns. Don't change the schema.
Yeah.
Code did not enforce that. Informal and ultimately easy to agree upon verbal contracts between developers made that possible. This was both a consequence of a very, very straightforward API design that, again, mocked basically how Mongo works, but just made it Mongo Plus. So a lot of what we wanted to do never required changes to the API, never required changes to what data was returned in publications. These two things are really what get baked in and make the difference between an iOS app that works and an app that crashes.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely, as we grow larger, it'll become a challenge to ensure that something that one person does who didn't have that informal agreement doesn't break what the other person's been doing. And where that'll happen the most is between changes to the web app that don't get magically propagated, like you say, hot code pushed to the iOS apps that are in the wild. We've addressed that challenge by having a very straightforward and rigorous identical staging environment setup. It's a way that we can literally test exactly what the experience would be if it were in production, and it means that we catch a lot of the kinds of, oh my God, we just updated our server and now 100% of users aren't being able to launch their iOS app. We certainly catch that, but the subtle details we've been missing, and we're about to do a big push towards writing tests, mocking the iOS app as an API consumer so that we can see if changes to the web app would cause current versions of the iOS app to break. We're doing a lot of work around kind of freezing in the way that the apps interact with the web server.
Yeah.
I'd say that's definitely been the biggest challenge.
Yeah, and that's kind of a little bit of a different challenge than most Meteor developers face, I think, because traditional development, more with other languages where you've got a client and a server, you do focus a lot more on an API, and Meteor being full stack, you don't tend to think API first the way you might if you were building, say, an app with a RESTful interface and then one or more clients for it. So when you're doing that, you tend to your API is really it's quite obvious, and it's very important that all your clients have to keep in sync. And with the Meteor app, that's just sort of a little bit hidden to you. But for you now, that's coming back to the surface. So you have to think of your DDP API as it being explicitly kind of like a public API, at least between your multiple teams, your multiple different types of developers.
That's right.
Yeah. And
definitely, like, as a development philosophy of mine, even when you're one person, you don't necessarily have to think about, well, what if somebody integrates with my service? Because who knows if that will ever happen.
Yeah.
But you should definitely think about, what if somebody were trying to use my code? What if somebody were a consumer of what I've written, and it's really very much a person, a developer, and that guided a lot of our decisions early on how to structure the API, how to write the web app. And it's been working really well for us. It makes it possible to onboard people fairly quickly with effectively no documentation. On the other hand, it can definitely be overwhelming for folks coming from far larger organizations where you might be used to having tests that tell you if you've broken something, where you're used to having somebody review everything that you've written. That's a very different convention. And those people are really good developers too. So you should really look at your code base as a responsibility to enable people. It can be as much about enabling yourself as enabling other people. And definitely to all the listeners who are considering writing packages, building apps, to invite other Meteor developers in, really think about, I want to keep things conventional. I want to keep things really easy to read and commented and very straightforward, because ultimately the simplicity means you've made something that will last in a way that might be longer than the app or the idea itself. And so we're really indebted to the community for writing a great deal of really good packages. And I think this is not a unique philosophy. Definitely, the way that we've overcome our iOS integration challenges is the same that many community developers have been writing packages and been very successful at getting their code adopted.
Yeah, great. Good advice. Okay. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. So one last question, though. Workpop is hiring. What type of people are you looking for?
Yeah, Workpop here in sunny Los Angeles, in our beautiful office in Santa Monica, is definitely looking for front-end, full stack, and Android developers to join us here. We're looking for folks who have had some experience building publicly accessible web apps. We know a lot of people have been working as consultants or working as making line of business software, apps that may not have had exposure to the public. We're really starting to transition to a point where we need a little bit of extra experience. Definitely if you've worked not necessarily on something that's as big as Twitter, but might be something like Telescope, or it might be a store, or something that we can really look at online and say, okay, this is something we can interact with and has to be maintained and has to be fairly durable. We really want you to join Workpop. So definitely, if you're excited about building what is probably the largest jobs website in Los Angeles, I bet will become the largest jobs website in the United States, we really want you to bring on your experience building public web apps, and you will be building a site that's as big as any other. It will really become a brand name, and that's really what we're looking for. And for our Android app, this is an opportunity to take the Android app that we've been developing, take ownership of it, and deliver the single largest unserved platform by Workpop, and make something that could really radically change a lot of people's lives in the conventions that many people who are using phones for the first time, using internet-enabled phones for the first time, you're giving them a way to find a job. You're giving them something that's very, very important to them. So the Android developer, definitely looking for somebody with a great deal of public experience, public app development experience. We have an absolutely phenomenal pair of iOS developers. We're really looking for somebody who's excited to work with one of the best mobile development teams in LA. So it's an enormous opportunity, and definitely anybody who wants to join us should.
All right. Sounds like a great opportunity. I would recommend get in touch with Ben. So how can people do that?
Send an email to our VP of Engineering, Luis Bittencourt, at luis@workpop.com. And then you'll be sure to get a response. You can also reach out to us at careers@workpop.com. Everybody reads those. We like to stick to our own scruples, just like we require our employers to respond in a very, very timely way. We respond to everything that's sent to careers@workpop.com. typically within 2 to 3 days. We're very, very effective at it. So don't be shy. There are no black holes with the people who are making a jobs website that's supposed to make that experience a lot better. We hold ourselves to that standard. So please, please, please reach out to us, and we'll be sure to give you a response with clear feedback on a yes or no, and definitely a view on the future of how we could work together.
Great, thanks. And if anyone wants to find you personally on the internet, how can they do that?
Definitely the best place to reach out to me is just straight through email at ben@workpop.com. You can also reach out to me through GitHub is a great place to ping me if you have any questions about any of the code we've released. And otherwise, I'm occasionally on the Meteor IRC chat room. It tends to be a little noisy, so I don't use it terribly often. But if you call out Dr. Pangloss on there, I'll be sure to respond. So definitely feel free to reach out to me on email. I read all my emails, and happy to hear about anyone having any Meteor problems or just need some guidance about what they're building.
Great. Cool. Thank you very much, Ben. It was great talking to you.
Thanks, Paul, and great talking with you too.